Hi, Ted Morrissey here. I'm making a video for my course in Lindenwood University's MFA in Writing program. One of the challenging things about teaching this course, which is kind of an introductory course, especially introductory to the workshop process, is that it's got a mixed bag of folks in terms of what your interests are. We've got some fiction writers, we've got some poets, we've got some creative nonfiction writers, and eventually I might encounter in here script writers and all kinds of different people. And on the one hand, I think there's an advantage to that. I think it's good for people to be exposed to other kinds of writing that they don't necessarily pursue themselves. Maybe eventually they will. So getting different perspectives on expression, so a fiction writer encountering the work of a poet and the work of a nonfiction essayist, etc., that can be, very beneficial. The tricky part is, as a teacher, is that it's hard to come up with things that are like equally relevant to all of you, because depending on your focus, there are different things that we certainly could talk about and different focuses that we could have. When I was working on my master's in English with a emphasis rather in fiction writing, that particular school, that particular department sort of sequestered all the fiction writers together and all the poets and all the nonfiction writers and all the screenwriters. And so you went through your entire program with other people who had the very same literary interests that you did. Your instructors were specifically accomplished in those particular areas. So you could get into some very in-depth discussions about your particular form of creative writing, right? It's more difficult when you have this group because not everything is, like I say, equally kind of beneficial and of interest. So thinking about that and thinking about the fact that we're getting near the end of our course, and as I say, this is introductory, so you're going to be going on and taking other courses and pursuing your MFA, over the next couple of years, probably for most of us. And I think it's worth thinking about what we're getting out of it. There was a time, of course, where pursuing an MFA was considered a terminal degree, or an MFA was considered a terminal degree. So people pursued it because they wanted to be professional writers. They wanted to teach in college, programs, particularly college writing programs, particularly creative writing and MFA programs. And having an MFA degree and having some publications was an entree into that world and so on. It's gotten very, very competitive over the last couple of decades, increasingly so. For one thing, it's even harder than it has been to make a living as a creative writer. So it's not much of a vocational track for people as maybe it used to be. And it's also not an easy route into getting a tenure track position to teach creative writing. Again, it used to be that if you had an MFA and some pretty good publication credits, you could get an interview and maybe get a job. But nowadays, there are so many people with MFAs that to get a tenure track creative writing position, particularly, you really need to have a PhD in creative writing and an MFA and a nice long list of publication credits and a couple of awards, hopefully. And then maybe you'll get an interview, right? So I don't say all this to discourage you, because I still think that pursuing an MFA is a valuable thing. Obviously, I teach an MFA program. I couldn't do that if I thought it was a complete waste of time for people, waste of time, waste of money. I do think that there is an advantage to this kind of pursuit, right? So it may not be an advantage in terms of making money, although I hope for some of you, many of you, it can turn into that if you want it to be. But I do think that there are other reasons to pursue this besides a sort of vocational, track. And they're related to this book, Homer's Odyssey, right? And what I mean by that is, this story, the story of the Odyssey of Odysseus trying to get home after 10 years in the Trojan War, and it takes him another 10 years to reach his home island of Ithaca, so a 20-year journey. it's about 3,000 years old. And we know that it was just one of many, many, many stories in that part of the world that had to do with similar kinds of topics. In fact, there's what we now refer to as the epic cycle. There were kind of three broad categories of ancient stories. And again, we're talking thousands of years old. The Odyssey is about 3,000 years old, give or take. And one category of stories was the Trojan War, which of course the Odyssey and the Iliad are a part of. There's also the Theban War, wars surrounding the city of Thebes, and there was the Titanic War stories about the Battle of the Gods and the Titans and so forth. And so there were all these stories at one time. Nearly all of them have vanished, right? We know they existed. We know something about them in terms of their basic plots and the characters and so forth, but there are very, very few that have come all the way down to us here in the 21st century. The Odyssey is one of them, and probably the best known of them. Of course, there is the Iliad, well known, but I don't think quite as well known as the Odyssey. And of course, the myth is that all of these great books were gathered together in the great library at Alexandria. It was destroyed through a terrible fire, and a lot of the manuscripts burned up, right? We're not sure if that really happened. For one thing, we're not really sure if there was an actual library at Alexandria. What we think of as a library and what the ancients may have thought of as a library are different concepts. So maybe it was a gathering of a lot of manuscripts in the city, but not necessarily in a single building. Even if there was a sort of single repository of all these different scrolls, it's not for sure that it burned down. It could very well be that just over time, the collection just sort of disappeared. People borrowed a scroll and forgot to return it. As a librarian, I can tell you that it's very, very possible, right? Or just, they were on material that disintegrated over time, and so we just literally kind of lost them to the ages. But among the very few stories that have come down to us, and again, probably the best well-known, is the Odyssey. And there could be a number of reasons for that. But one may be, I'm going to kind of run up the flagpole here, is that the Odyssey has a very special focus. On the surface, it's a story, again, of Odysseus and his efforts to reach home, to return to his wife and son. And then he has all these misadventures along the way, which are recounted in the poem. The story of the being trapped in the Cyclops cave, the being attracted by the sirens, the dangerous sirens who want to, maroon you on their shore and then devour you. The Circe, the witch, who wants to turn you into animals, and not to mention all the human obstacles that Odysseus has to face and get beyond, and so forth. So on the surface, it's an adventure story about this journey to get home. But if you read it, and read it carefully, and read it many times, and teach it for about 20 years, I think you start to have a different understanding of the poem. I don't think it's really about a journey from point A to point B, with point B being Ithaca. I think it's a journey of self-discovery. I think what the poem is about the main character, Odysseus, trying to discover himself. Again, if you're familiar with the poem more than just on a sort of superficial level, you may recall that the story of Odysseus's time in Troy and what happened to him and how he responded to it, that is repeated again and again and again in the poem. And I think that that's a reflection of, again, this idea of trying to come to grips with ourself, our personality, our history, how we've responded to different situations over time, and to just really get to know ourselves, our true self. And in my mind, the search for Ithaca is the search for your true self, your true identity. Again, in the poem, you may be familiar with the fact that Odysseus, in his travels, whenever he meets someone, he will make up a story about who he is and what his history is. And there's some truth to it, but there's a lot of fiction to it as well, until ultimately he does reach home and his identity is fully known, right? So again, I think that the story, the poem, is about the search for self, a full realization of who we are, a full understanding of ourselves and our history. And perhaps that is why it's one of the few stories that have come down to us from those ancient times, because of its being so important to readers and hearers of the tale. And even if they don't necessarily absorb on a first reading or a first hearing that it's an exploration of self, I think subconsciously, unconsciously, there is that sense of it, and therefore it elevates its importance, and maybe that's why it's come down to us. What does all this have to do with the MFA program? In my mind, the pursuit of the MFA, the pursuit of a degree in writing, whether it's fiction or poetry or creative nonfiction or script writing or whatever it may be, is about a search for self. It's about coming to know ourselves better. So at the end of it, will you be in a position to make lots and lots of money, to be famous, to be powerful, whatever you want to say in that regard? Maybe for a few of us, perhaps, if that's what we want. But for the rest of us, or all of us really, we will know ourselves better. And more importantly, we're going to have the tools, the skill set, and the knowledge to continue that process as we age, as we evolve, as life experiences have their way with us. We will be better equipped to assess them, to understand them, to express something of them to the world, and in that process, get to know ourselves even better. All right. So that's the thought I want to leave you with as we get near the end of our course. But yet, as you are sort of just starting your journey to Ithaca, if you will, again, it's a path of self-discovery, which I think is important, and I think it's worthwhile.